Okay. Is it like comedy or drama or a little bit of both? And people come to that? So my adopted mom, she's like, yo, you can choose an American name. What do you want? I chose Mike Evans. Yeah. Which is like the whitest name you could think of. Yeah.
Well, that right there was a snippet from our next guest, who's an award-winning actor and playwright, and has returned to San Francisco with his critically acclaimed hit, Border People. Joining me now to chat more is actor Dan Hoyle. Dan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Olivia.
Yeah, we saw a quick snippet of what people can expect from some of your productions. But before we get into the production, let's first talk about you as an actor. Dan, when did it all begin, and when did you first find that big success in your career?
My dad was an actor and performer, so I had it as a model. And I guess the first show that really toured a lot was a show called Things They Happen, and that was the first time I went to New York and performed off Broadway for a long time, and really knew that I could make a life doing this.
Yeah, that's so amazing. And now that is exactly what you're doing. Made a life being a performer and, you know, creating plays and all these amazing things that you're doing. So let's talk specifically about Border People. What is this production overall in the view if people come to see it?
Yeah, it's 10 stories based on real conversations, interviews I had with people. I call it the journalism of hanging out. So I go out with an idea, a theme, something I'm curious about, and talk to people, develop relationships, hear their stories, and then create stories and characters based on those and perform that out. So the audiences get to experience what I experienced, but like in a 75-minute, very highly sculpted form. And
why did you want to take this approach when it came to Border People? What inspired you to go out and have these conversations with strangers?
It's what I've been doing for like 20 years now. I was always interested in bringing the excitement of the streets, the excitement of real stories, real people to the stage. I love the combination of journalism and theater so that people see these characters embodied, fully get to experience, you know, how funny it was, how interesting it was, and experience that vulnerability firsthand.
That's really cool. I like that approach too, because oftentimes when it comes to theater or movies, sometimes they're not always based off true events or true stories, right? So to take that, like you said, what you met, people in the streets, and then bring it to the stage is pretty darn cool. So what can people expect when they come to see Border People? So
yeah, it's 10 different stories, 10 different characters that are very different, and they are based on real conversations. Some of them are on the southern border with Mexico. There's like a Border Patrol guy who pulls me over and ends up being interested in like stand-up comedy. There's a rancher who ends up being much more interesting than I could have imagined. He's a goat rancher, he's pagan, he is an environmental activist, and then there's stories from the northern border, Canada, refugees fleeing to Canada, but they're all surprising. So it's like an Afghani kid who is still wearing his prom haircut and talking about both life in Afghanistan and like getting drunk after prom, hanging out with like hick kids at his preppy school. Yeah. So it's like a lot of different mixes, it sounds like. It sounds like people can find a little bit of everything. Yeah, and I think the common theme is just you meet these complex, surprising, funny stories. And part of what the show is called Border People, because it's like we all cross certain borders in our life every day, right? And it's really to humanize, sometimes we sort of other people who are maybe have crossed over a certain type of border, but it's like, hey, we all do that. We're all cultural border crossers in some way. And so people really relate to these characters. And the cool thing is some of the folks portrayed in the show have come and seen the show too. Really? Yeah, yeah. So I'm curious, when they have come to see the show, what have they said about you kind of reenacting that conversation? Yeah, it's really powerful. So when I was in New York doing it, there was a couple characters based in New York, and one night there was a guy, Larry, in the front row, and when I started doing this story, I saw him go. And at the end of the show, as I'm walking off, he gave me a big hug, said, "My man." So it's really powerful. We had one guy who came back 6 times in the 5-week run. Wow. People really feel like honored, and I really try really hard. I work incredibly hard to make people feel seen and understood. Like most people go through the world not really feeling understood on much of a level, and it's an opportunity to say, hey, I want to hear how you feel and think right now. And people are like, oh, okay. Nobody asked me about my story, so yeah.
That's beautiful, and so appreciative that you have done that and made so many people feel heard and seen. But for you personally, when you've gone out and had these conversations, what did that do to you as an individual?
Yeah, it makes me feel like, so when I'm in a migrant shelter talking to somebody in Mexico, or I'm in a going into Canada, hearing these stories, I just feel this huge responsibility to tell them well, and to tell them with all the complexity and humor, right? Sometimes we think of these stories as being like, oh, it's going to be so depressing. It's like, actually, you come to the show, there's a huge amount of comedy, because these are human beings, and actually what they've lived through and what they've been able to overcome, and their sense of themselves is like really inspiring. You know, at a time we can feel like, oh my God, the news is so heavy. It's actually like, look, these are people that have transformed despite these setbacks, and it's a real show about resiliency.
Oh, amazing. Well, how can people catch the show? Tell me when and where, all the good details.
Yeah, so we're at the Marsh Theater in San Francisco, and we have just extended. We're adding shows in December and January, so folks can go to themarsh.org. I believe that's there's also my website, danhoyle.com, but they should go to themarsh.org and find all the details, yeah.
Awesome. Well, Dan, thank you so much for joining us.